Joining me now is Christina Deconcini. She is Director of the Government Affairs at World Resources Institute, an organization dedicated to global sustainability. And Tyson Slocum is the Director of the Energy Program at Public Citizen, a consumer advocacy organization. Welcome, both of you, to the show. Christina, I want to start with you. Your group hosted a Rising Tide Summit recently, and this is what we're going to be talking about a lot in Paris. Low-lying nations, whether it's atolls in the Pacific or areas of Europe that could be really affected by climate change right now, just a small change in the degrees. How seriously are world leaders going to have to take this issue in Paris?
I think they're going to take it very seriously, and that they are taking it seriously. The question of international finance going into Paris is all around providing resources for adaptation for countries that
adaptation means
building resiliency and adapting to impacts from climate change, such as sea level rise.
So the climate change is already going to be happening.
Right, and what kind of measures you're going to take, what kind of infrastructure, what kind of green infrastructure, how are you going to make it safe for people to continue to live there? And so that's going to be a key part. Of course, the main point of getting mitigation on greenhouse gases is the ultimate solution. But in the meantime, a lot of people do need help in dealing with the impacts that are already coming their way and building more resiliency.
Tyson, that's the main point, isn't it? That climate change is here already. So even if people sign on to ambitious targets to cut fossil fuels and emissions, countries like the Maldives, Fiji, already could be under direct threat. So what can Paris lay out for them?
Well, I'm not sure that whatever agreement is done in Paris is going to be able to stop the changes that we're seeing, particularly with island nations in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. Over the last 30 years, we've already seen sea levels rise more than a foot, and the United States Geological Survey just did a big report a couple months ago that found that 500,000 people living, particularly in atoll islands in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, could be at risk in the next couple of decades. These are islands that were formed around collapsed volcanoes that currently are shallow coral reef systems. Most of these reef systems are about 6 feet above sea level. So in the next couple of decades, regardless of what we do in Paris, we could be looking at complete immersion of these island nations, and we've got to figure out what to do with the 500,000 people living there.
So we're seeing Syrian refugees crisis. Could we be seeing a whole generation of climate change refugees in these areas? What sort of effects could that have, Christina?
Yeah, that will have huge effects, and we could see that. Obviously, there's a lot of different push factors that force refugees to leave a country, but when it becomes uninhabitable because of sea level rise, that is going to be a big one. And that's why the Department of Defense and the Navy here in the United States really understand the magnitude of this risk, because it's
a security risk.
It's a security risk, and it's a global risk if entire nations or parts of nations are forced to flee and can no longer live where they have been living. What's
the cost of this? The $100 billion a year, Tyson, number's been floated around in a global economy that's not growing that fast. That's a tall order for developed economies to shell out. Are we going to get that?
Well, I think it's something that the developed economies can definitely afford, and we need to provide this funding to the global south to help with clean energy deployment and adaptation to the effects of climate change that they're already experiencing. The problem is the politics of financing this, and particularly in the United States, we still have deep divisions around the issue of climate change, not really among the American public, but in the representatives that they send to Congress on their behalf. Most of those members of Congress that deny the science of climate change, that have explicitly said they're going to fight the Obama administration efforts to provide that financing to developing economies, a lot of them are being controlled by the fossil fuel interests that give to their campaigns.
So if the US is going to pay this money, some of this money, maybe 20, 30 billion, whatever, how can they do that if the US Congress controls the purse strings here? You've seen a lot of people at local level here take climate change very seriously and start to adapt, right, Christina?
Yes. Well, so those are two different questions, but one of the things is the $100 billion is a combination of public and private finance.
Good point, yes.
So, and it's global, so there's a lot more that could be said about that, but it's a pretty detailed situation, and I think the US will come forward with some amount of finance. It won't be enough, but And yes, we have very much in the United States, sea level rise is a huge issue for a lot of coastal communities, and they are taking it very serious at a local level. We just held this event you referenced, the Rising Tide Summit. We had 40 local elected officials, mostly mayors from 18 of the 23 U.S. coastal states, and there were as many Republicans as Democrats, because on the local level here, if the water is coming in and it's affecting your community and you're a mayor, you're going to need to respond to that, and there is no partisan place for bickering around that. So our hope is that those voices in a fast enough way will bubble up so that on a national level we can move away from this partisan debate that Tyson was referring to.
Yeah, I want to get into that in terms of what low-lying countries like the Maldives bring to the table in Paris. We're actually going to speak to some of their representatives a bit later on. But what sort of message do they bring? Because they really have to bang the table now and say, look, we may not exist if you guys don't step up. Do you think that's the way to go? Do you think that's what they'll be doing?
They definitely are kind of the canary in the coal mine, right? These are the countries that are on the front line of the impacts of climate change. We have documented what sea level rise is doing to their island nations, and so they have every right and they have an obligation to be pounding the table to say, while the rest of the world continues to debate this issue of climate change, we're on the front lines of being forced to deal with it. And so I do think that they help bring that sense of urgency that I do believe that leaders of countries from the United States to China and in Europe have come to an agreement to acknowledge that climate change needs to be one of the important factors in talking about diplomacy and in getting a consensus around the world. And so that's impressive. The details of what is cobbled together in Paris may not match what the scientists are demanding of us, but we are making progress. And I think what's going to come out of Paris is a consensus that world leaders are going to continue working to address climate change.
Christina, last word. I suppose if you save countries like the Maldives, it means you can save cities like New York and Mumbai and Venice. So
Miami.
So it's a real test time.
Yes, I think that's really true. And we need to be able to figure out how to protect those people. And that is going to be a universal lesson that we'll be able to use here in the United States or other places that are facing the same kind of risks.